Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin. You are watching The Digital Age. Tonight's show is about China. On November 14th, a little over a week after the U.S. presidential elections, China unveiled its new leaders, a gang of 7 men, and it made its announcement over Twitter. Who are these men, and what does their elevation portend for the future of Chinese policy and also for U.S.-China relations? Here to help us answer these questions is an expert in the field. She is Elizabeth Economy. Liz Economy is the Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we're delighted to welcome you back to the show.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Now, Liz, the present president until the end of the year is Hu Jintao. He goes. The gang of 7 comes in. What's going to happen to him?
Well, Hu Jintao, somewhat surprisingly, is retiring from all of his posts. In recent tradition, the current president has held on to at least one position for a year or two longer, namely that on the Central Military Commission. But Hu Jintao is out. He becomes one of the party elders who will try to meddle in all the future policy decisions, but he's not going to hold any real position, formal position within the Chinese government or party.
Okay, now he's out, but his predecessor, who was Jiang Zemin, seems to be coming back into favor, or is this just idle speculation?
No, I think it's one of the real surprises, frankly, in terms of this 18th Party Congress and this next generation of leaders that emerged in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, was the extent to which Jiang Zemin and some of the other former senior leaders really were responsible for the selection of this leadership. It was quite a bit more conservative group of leaders than I think many of us had anticipated. We didn't see some of the big reformers come into play, and some of those people were really Hu Jintao's people. But what this particular group of leaders really represented was a triumph of Jiang Zemin and some of the former old-time party leaders and their continued control in many respects over the personnel process.
So he's 82 years old. He's supposed to be in failing health. Interestingly enough, I read that his name has been jammed on Weibo. If you do a search for Jiang Zemin, you don't get anything. I mean, do you think he's really going to make a bid to come back into power, or to
no, there's no way
be the puppeteer?
No, I mean, I think he is the puppeteer, though. There's no way in which he's coming back into any really significant formal position of power. That's simply not going to happen. But again, he's clearly wielded quite a bit of influence in this selection process this time around. The sort of 5 new faces in the Standing Committee, so not Xi Jinping and not Li Keqiang, the top 2, but the 5 that came into being in the Standing Committee, really were all tied in some way to Jiang Zemin. So this really was, again, I think, quite a coup for Jiang and his still remaining power.
Well, let's take the top 2. There's Xi Jinping. He disappeared for a while, didn't he?
Right, Xi Jinping, who is the new president of China, and a strong figure, certainly stronger than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. He disappeared for 2 weeks, right in the throes, right in the immediate sort of month and a half before the party congress. There was a lot of speculation that he was in some form of political trouble. People thought he might have had a stroke. You know, out of Beijing, they said he'd had an accident while he was swimming.
But someone said somebody threw a chair at him. And
that I hadn't heard.
In the course of a heated debate, yeah.
But when I was in Beijing, I think what I heard most was that he himself had taken himself out to observe what was going on, that there was a lot of very heated politicking and jockeying for power still going on, and that he didn't want to be caught in the crossfire, and so that his stepping back was really a matter of personal choice. You know, that's what I heard when I was there. You know, whether that's the reality, I think we don't know still. But he made it to the top. Whatever he was doing for those 2 weeks clearly didn't
he did the right thing.
He did the right thing.
Now, China has always been a place where there are a lot of rumors, and a lot of the rumors, particularly about what's going on in the government, have been suppressed. When you were in Beijing, did you find that rumors about Xi were abounded, or were they sort of whispered?
Well, rumors abound and abounded when I was there, and I think, as you know, the whole internet space is just chock full of rumors. And even if names are banned or if particular rumors are banned, the people on the internet find a way around it. There's almost nothing that happens in the political world today that can be completely kept from the Chinese people. It's a very different world today than it was 5 years ago.
Now, particularly in America, we're intrigued with the cult of personality of political leaders. What is Xi's background? Where does he come from, and what do you think he's like?
Well, Xi Jinping is the son of a very prominent former Chinese leader, someone who was considered to be actually quite a reformer, someone who had condemned the Tiananmen Square massacre. Really was at the forefront in some ways of the political reform leaderships, had strong principles. It's not clear that Xi Jinping has inherited any of these beliefs. Xi's political trajectory is one where he was sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, to a very difficult and impoverished place. He ran away at first after 6 months. He didn't like it there, not surprisingly, but then went back and decided it was important for him to try to make it work. He applied to become a party member 8 times before he was selected because of his family background, sort of an elitist background, which was not a good thing during the Cultural Revolution. But what it also suggests to me is that he's someone for whom the party matters a lot. And not someone, I think, that is going to be very quick to move on very significant political reform or to do anything that's going to diminish the power of the party. He's had a very traditional rise through the party as a party secretary. He was a personal secretary to an important person in the Chinese, who had responsibility for the Chinese military, so he's considered to have good ties to the Chinese military. But by and large, he's been a cautious figure. Not someone who's been associated with any significant political or economic reform, a consensus builder. He has said that anybody who assumes a position of power should be someone who builds upon the past accomplishments, and then within the next year sort of sets out his own agenda as well. So maybe we'll see something coming from him within this first year that will sort of strike a slightly different note. But by and large, I think he's someone who's going to want to continue to build upon what China has already become today.
Now, Xi Jinping is number 2. Do you see him as being different, or do you see him as a yes man for the top guy?
Well, Li Keqiang is the number 2.
I'm sorry,
that's okay. Xi Jinping is the number 1.
Number 1,
But Li Keqiang is slightly different. Li Keqiang is thought to be a little bit more intellectual. Trained as a lawyer, has a PhD, economist, somewhat anyway, not considered to be the strongest in the economic sphere, but still knowledgeable. And he, during his years as a university student, was quite reform-oriented and did sort of stand with the the sort of bolder reform-oriented group within the university. So there are hints that Li Keqiang would be somebody who would be interested in pushing forward with political reform. But here too, his career through the party has not been particularly impressive. He hasn't done anything of real note, hasn't struck out in any significant way. So will he be a yes man? Maybe not a complete yes man, but it's hard to see that he's going to be a strong independent force within the standing committee.
And what about the other 5? I mean, is anything to be made of the fact that there are no women in the Gang of 7?
Well, there's nothing to be made of it since there never really has ever been, but I think there had been some hope that there was one woman.
Madame Mao was no slouch. So.
Well, no, but she really wasn't in this. She was part of the Gang of 4, Jiang Qing. It's a little bit different, but I think there was a woman, Liu Yandong, who had the potential to be named to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, but she was a long shot, and it didn't happen. And China is not really renowned for having a wide sort of and deep bench of senior women political figures. They really haven't developed that yet, and I think that's going to be increasingly an issue for them moving forward. I think there are a lot of calls among women in China, frankly, to see more women in leadership positions. But I think in terms of the other 5, what's interesting is they, again, do come from the more traditional and conservative, generally, part of the sort of range of candidates that could have been selected. Also, the positions that they've been assigned, that were somewhat surprising. They took the person who was considered to be the strongest on the economy, Wang Qishan, held by many within China and in the United States, to be the person who could probably push forward with bold economic reform, and they put him in charge of the anti-corruption campaign. And you could argue that that's good to have one of the strongest leaders in charge of one of the most pressing problems that the party faces. But I think there's a missed opportunity here in terms of moving forward with economic reform. So he's been put in that position. They put probably the most conservative person in charge of the National People's Congress, Zhang Dejiang, which is unfortunate because the National People's Congress is an area where you could have hoped to see some change and some movement. That's very unlikely to happen now. So it was a kind of, I would say that the people who were most interested in economic and political reform of those remaining 5 have been put in some of the weakest positions, whereas those who are more conservative really have the more important positions within the party and the government.
So unlike the United States, the conservatives won out.
Yes.
Now, the word that seems to be repeated again and again in terms of the changeover in China is reform. And political reform, economic reform, reform in foreign policy. So breaking it down, do you see areas for political reform? And then we can go to economic reform, and then we can get reform, and then we can go down to foreign policy.
Well, there are lots of areas for political reform.
Right.
Whether they move forward on them, I think remains a big question. I think the kind of political reform that we're likely to see coming out of a Xi Jinping-led standing committee will be twofold, two-part. First, what they call intra-party democracy, right? So basically allowing the members of the Communist Party to have more say in who's leading them, right, and to have more voice. So it won't be so much a top-down selection process, but that you'll have more candidates for positions within the party, and they'll be allowed to vote within the party, okay, not extending to the broad masses of the Chinese public.
And that might include women.
Yes, it'll definitely include the women party members.
Yes.
And the second area is what's called deliberative democracy. And that's the idea, particularly at the local level, that you really do want to have a way of engaging the Chinese people, the Chinese public, in the policy-making process, not giving away any control over decision-making, but at least listening to them in a way that's not just over the internet, right, or via mass protests on the street. So in some ways trying to reduce the pressure, societal pressure, by engaging them. So this would mean something like having a period of time where the local public budget would be open to the people to review and to discuss and to debate and to feed their opinions to the local officials. And there have been some experiments going on with this in a number of the southern provinces of China. So this is the kind of change of reform that we might see being spread throughout more of the country moving forward.
So the rubber really meets the road in the provincial governments more than almost the centralized government, isn't that right?
Well, it is extremely important what happens at the local level. But I think as we've seen in the very recent, several months with these revelations about the extraordinary wealth of some of the very top senior leaders, there's a growing sense in the Chinese public that their belief that everything was sort of clean and good at the center and everything's down and dirty down where they live maybe isn't true, that there needs to be some change up at the top as well.
Well, in his exit speech, Hu Jintao denounced corruption. He said corruption, I think he said, imperiled the viability of the party and might imperil the viability of the Chinese state. Well, what corruption is he referring to? His predecessor, who with his family owned a big stake in a failed insurance company he was favoring?
Right. So when
is that the kind of corruption?
When Dao was premier, I think maybe he was referring to that, but maybe not. What he might have really been referring to was sort of the endemic corruption, right? Just all throughout the Chinese system. Recently, a Chinese democracy sort of scholar and activist said to me, at this point in time, it costs 1 million yuan to become a county head, right? So in the bribes that you have to pay out as you move through the ladder to become the head of a county, costs you basically $180,000 or something like that. So it's endemic, right? Whether you're in business or whether you're in government, it's people having to pay, the local teachers extra money so their child can sit next to a heater, during the winter months, or paying more for your medicine, whatever it is. I think this is the kind of corruption that leads to those 180,000 protests a year, that provides all that fodder for all the internet sort of discontent that we see. I think this is the kind of corruption that Hu Jintao is talking about.
And well, you have this purge of Xi-Lai, and it's said that he was involved with corruption. I mean, is that an aspect of the crackdown on corruption, or was that a political
I think it was probably
kind of crackdown?
both. It was both. And frankly, the way that the Chinese government has always, corruption has been an issue since Mao Zedong, right? When he very first took power, 1949, 1951, he launched his first campaign, which had as a central aspect of it getting rid of corruption among government officials and in the business community. So we're talking about something that's been around for 60 years within the party. It's been a problem. And they've never found a way to address it effectively. And that's because what they do is exactly what they did in the Xi-Lai case, which is just simply target one person, right, and go after him, or 2 or 3 and 5 of his associates, pluck them out and say, see, we're making progress, right? We're implementing the rule of law. Clearly, that's not what's happening, right? The corruption is endemic. It requires systemic reform to address it. And so unless we see that kind of discussion coming out of this new standing committee, we're not going to see anything new. If all we hear is going to be another anti-corruption campaign, that's been going on for 60 years.
And you see any sign that they're going to change to getting after systemic corruption, as opposed to picking out some piñata and putting him in jail for a while?
I think the only sign is the appointment of Wang Qishan, this very strong-willed and very impressive Chinese leader to head the anti-corruption campaign. But again, it requires things such as opening up the media, right? Sort of airing your dirty linen, and that's not something that the party has been very good about. And so, again, unless we see more fundamental reform.
Not even a railroad accident.
No. And in fact, the person who really wanted to cover up that giant railroad accident is now in charge of the National People's Congress, Zhang Dezhang. He was one of the people who was appointed to the standing committee.
Now, you've mentioned protests. There have been protests during the last year throughout the country over a variety of issues. Recently, I think someone self-immolated, burned himself alive over the government's Tibetan policy and attitude toward the Dalai Lama. I mean, do you see any new attitude to accommodate, conciliate with these protesters?
No, and in fact, I think, again, looking at this new leadership, what we see is at least 2 people, Zhang Dezhang, who is the head of the National People's Congress and who was in charge of Guangdong province during SARS, where he basically was responsible for allowing SARS to spread because he just clamped down, and he was responsible for newspaper editors being jailed for publishing things that were a little too investigative or progressive. His attitude is sort of clamp down on things. Another member, Liu Yunchan, who's going to be in charge of the propaganda, and who's been a central person in charge of propaganda and public security to date, is another person whose general attitude toward protest and discontent is to clamp down. So it's going to be surprising to me, frankly, if you see a lighter hand in addressing sort of social unrest. The people that I think would have brought a different touch were 2 people, Li Yuanchao and Wang Yang, who didn't make it onto the standing committee of the Politburo.
Didn't make it. Now, what about economic reform? Are they going to be robust in their advocacy of economic reform, or their implementation of economic reform?
Well, it's possible. Anything is possible, I suppose. They know what needs to be done. There's no mystery here. And I think the kinds of things they want to transform China from a manufacturing to an innovation nation, and rebalancing the economy and getting rid of vested interests, the state-owned enterprises, sort of breaking them down and allowing private enterprise to flourish more in the country. These things are well known, and are they going to be able to make progress? That's going to depend on Li Keqiang, the premier, and Zhang Gaoli, who is the former party secretary in Tianjin, whose mode of development of Tianjin, though, has been very traditional, a lot of infrastructure development, a lot of lending, not a lot of breaking down of state-owned enterprises or anything like that. If Wang Qishan continues to play a role in the economy, if he's not simply relegated to anti-corruption, then I think there's some prospect for further economic reform. But again, they haven't really put in place the kind of strong economic team within the Standing Committee of the Politburo that signals that this is their #1 priority, and they're going to push forward, very aggressively on a number of these issues in the next, 2 to 3 years.
Well, one aspect of their economic policy has been the one-child policy, because it's a country of, 1.3 billion people, and the per capita income will, of course, increase if there are fewer capitas. Now, there's some indication I read recently that they want to relax the one-child policy. What's to be made of that?
Well, I think it's really interesting. A year or so ago, there was an article written in the Chinese newspaper by one of the primary architects of the one-child policy. And he said, the one-child policy was never intended to last forever. It was a 30-year experiment, and it ends this year. So there was the beginning of some pressure to reform the one-child policy from the person who designed it, right, beginning at least last year. There were experiments that were supposed to be going on in 5 or 6 provinces to loosen restrictions, to test out what would happen if you released it a little bit. But they seemed not to go very far. And now I understand that, in fact, they are talking about allowing people in urban areas to have more than one child, even if they're not both only children. That was sort of the stipulation, that if you were an only child married to an only child, you could have 2 children. Of course, by now, we've had 30 years of only children, right? So most people in China, right, are only children. So in many respects, this new policy reform could simply be a reflection of reality, right? Because you're going to have, 2 children being allowed in many households because of their only children married to only children after 30 years of this reform. But I think there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern about the aging, the demographic shift, the fact that you don't have enough young people for the workforce, don't have enough young people to take care of the old people. The pension system is a mess in the country. So I think there are a number of reasons why the Chinese government is concerned about the demographics of the country now in particular.
Now, what about their foreign policy, their attitude toward other countries? I mean, they recently redid their passport to show a map of China, which includes disputed areas in the South China Sea. Usually with economic growth comes nationalism and a larger military, and you would think a kind of expansionism. Do you see any of that here, an assertiveness in the new regime, more so than existed with Hu Jintao?
Well, it's too early to say, certainly, and you have to realize that they haven't actually taken power yet. So even though they're sort of, nothing is going to happen that doesn't really have their imprimatur to some extent, they're not making the policy right now, right? So they don't really take power.
All they've done is disappear.
Right, they don't take power till the spring. But certainly we've seen in the past few years a much more assertive China. And the question for this leadership is whether they want to take a step back. And because this assertive leadership has, brought them into hot water with many of their neighbors, and in fact had everything to do with the U.S. Reassertion of U.S. engagement in the region through the pivot or the rebalancing, as we now call it. But yes, the passport is a perfect example, and it's managed to irritate, the Philippines, Vietnam, India. I mean, everybody is Taiwan even is
all their
is
former allies or potential allies.
Right. I mean, if you look
who do they have left? Just North Korea.
North Korea, that's right, because Burma, Myanmar is out of their pocket as well. So I think you can't quite understand why they're doing this, because something like this is simply just poking people in the eye, and what is the point? So the question for this new leadership is, are they going to take a step back and sort of adopt the sort of mantle or mantra of Deng Xiaoping, hide brightness, cherish obscurity, focus on their domestic economic development again, and have that win-win, rising tide lifts all boats kind of policy, instead of this much more moving from a near seas to far coastal defense, a much more assertive foreign policy. So I think we'll see over the next probably 6 to 9 months in which direction this new leadership is going to move.
Well, or Mao counseled, when you encounter straw, advance, and you encounter steel, withdraw. So, I mean, what do you? They don't like to be encircled. Do you think there's straw around them, or do you think that there's steel?
They created this. They created this themselves. You know, they have no one to blame for this, quote, encirclement at this point. The fact that they've managed to agitate, you know, virtually all their neighbors and create enemies where they had friends 5 years ago. I mean, China's foreign policy was considered a model of diplomacy 5 or 6 years ago. So they really need to take stock of what they've done to change the dynamic in the region and whether they want to change it back.
And what should the U.S. be doing about all this? I mean, Romney said on day one we should brand them a currency manipulator. Or, I mean, what should our relationship be? Yes,
well, Romney was going to have a very busy day because I think he was also going to get rid of Obamacare that day too. So, you know, I don't know what he was planning to do, but I guess we don't have to worry about it. I think one of the things that we ought to be considering, I think the U.S. policy in the region is generally a pretty good one at this point. I think that the pivot, the pushing forward with the TPP, et cetera, I think these are good policies to have. By the same token, I think we've got to work with China. And I think in one area that we could start thinking about more aggressively ourselves would be in the trade and investment front, because one of the things that we're seeing is, and I think we're likely to see, is very, very aggressive Chinese investment in the U.S. Right, and we need to think about how we want that investment to be structured.
Yes.
Right? State-owned enterprises coming, a lot of things we have to think through.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. This has been just wonderful, but can you tell me, do you see that there'll be reforms in China over the next decade?
Over the next decade, yes.
Yes.
Because this leadership will be out in 5 years.
Oh, they have only 5 years as opposed to...
Five of them have only 5 years. The only ones who have 2 years are Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang.
Right.
So we're going to get a new 5 coming in 5 years.
So, good. So, Liz Economy, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you,
This
Jim.
has been just marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. For the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.